It was tucked away in a hidden corner of a cave in Menorca, Spain, sealed inside a container made of antler bone and dyed a deep, vibrant red. At first glance, it looked like a simple funerary keepsake, a memento of a lost loved one from the Bronze Age. But when scientists finally ran a chemical analysis on those strands, they didn't just find ancient DNA. They found a cocktail of powerful hallucinogens, scopolamine, ephedrine, and atropine, still lingering in the hair shafts 3 millennia later. These people weren't just using drugs. They were living with them, ritualizing them, and perhaps even building their entire worldview around the visions they provided. But how does a group of Bronze Age humans living on a Mediterranean island find these specific, dangerous alkaloids? Why did they choose to preserve that evidence so carefully? And if we look even further back into the shadows of our prehistory, how much of our evolution was fueled by the pursuit of an altered state? Is it possible that the very thing we consider a modern social problem was actually the engine that drove us to become human in the first place? To find the beginning of that thread, we have to look past the earliest humans and into the behavior of the creatures we share the planet with today. For a long time, researchers assumed that intoxication was a uniquely human vice, a side effect of our complex brains and the stresses of civilization. But the work of Dr. Ronald K. Siegel, a psychopharmacologist who spent decades observing animal behavior, suggests something much more fundamental. Siegel argued for the existence of a fourth drive, a biological impulse for intoxication that is as powerful and ingrained as the drives for hunger, thirst, and sex. He documented dozens of species that go out of their way to seek out psychoactive substances in the wild. We see it in the Siberian reindeer that obsessively hunt for the Amanita muscaria mushroom, a potent psychedelic that they consume despite the fact that it makes them lose coordination and run in erratic circles. We see it in the wallabies of Tasmania, who have been caught breaking into commercial poppy fields to eat the heads of opium-producing flowers before hopping in perfect, dizzying circles until they collapse. Even in the ocean, the behavior persists. Bottlenose dolphins have been observed by marine biologists carefully passing around a pufferfish, nipping at its skin just enough to release a low dose of tetrodotoxin. They don't kill the fish, they treat it like a communal pipe, passing it from one pod member to another before floating at the surface in what appears to be a trance-like state. If these diverse species are all hardwired to seek out ways to escape their ordinary consciousness, why would our own ancestors have been any different? Could this drive have been the secret catalyst for our first steps toward civilization? But if the impulse to get high is truly a biological universal, then our first encounter with these substances wasn't a discovery, it was an inevitability. For decades, the dominant narrative in archaeology was that humans settled down to grow grain because they were hungry, leading to the agricultural revolution. We were told that bread was the foundation of the first cities. However, a growing number of researchers, led by experts like Dr. Patrick McGovern, often called the Indiana Jones of ancient beverages, are beginning to suspect we've had the story backward. In 2018, at a site called Rakefat Cave in modern-day Israel, archaeologists discovered stone mortars belonging to the Natufian culture, dating back roughly 13,000 years. This was long before the invention of the plow, before the domestication of wheat, and before anyone was living in a permanent town. Yet, chemical analysis of those mortars revealed starches and microscopic plant remains that were the unmistakable residue of a brewing process. These prehistoric hunter-gatherers were making beer from wild barley and wheat thousands of years before they were baking loaves of bread. This discovery lent massive weight to the beer before bread hypothesis. The theory suggests that the massive, labor-intensive effort required to cultivate grain wasn't motivated by a need for calories, which were plentiful in the wild, but by a desire for a reliable supply of alcohol for communal rituals. If the primary motivation for the birth of agriculture was actually the production of an intoxicant, what does that say about the foundation of every city and empire that followed? Does it mean that civilization was built not on a full stomach, but on a shared experience of the divine through chemistry? The deeper we look, the more we find that these substances were never used in a vacuum. They were the focal point of the earliest human technologies. In the Jiahu site in China's Hunan province, Dr. McGovern and his team analyzed pottery jars from 9,000 years ago and found the chemical fingerprints of a complex, extreme fermented beverage. It was a mixture of rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and wild grapes. This wasn't a simple accidental fermentation. It was a carefully crafted recipe that required a sophisticated understanding of botany and chemistry. These people were biomolecular engineers of the Neolithic. By the time we reach the Bronze Age, the evidence becomes even more specific and ritualized. Back at the Menorca cave, Cueva de los Carrots, the hair analysis performed by Dr. Elisa Garridoche revealed that the drugs being consumed weren't for pleasure, they were for transformation. The combination of atropine and scopolamine found in those red-dyed tubes comes from plants like mandrake, henbane, or thornapple. These are not recreational drugs in the modern sense. They are deliriants that cause profound hallucinations, extreme pupil dilation, and a feeling of flying or leaving one's body. The hair analysis showed that the subjects had been consuming these plants for at least a year leading up to their death. This suggests a dedicated, specialized role within the community, a shaman or a ritual leader whose job it was to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. If these specialized knowledge keepers were the ones guiding the tribe, how much of our early social structure was dictated by what they saw in those drug-induced trances? And if these substances were being traded across vast distances, how much did they influence the first global trade networks? The reach of these visionary plants was far more global than we once dared to imagine. While the Bronze Age Europeans were experimenting with nightshades, cultures on the other side of the planet were mastering their own local pharmacopoeia. In the Pamir Mountains of western China, at a site called the Jirzhankel Cemetery, researchers in 2019 used a technique called gas chromatography mass spectrometry to analyze wooden braziers that were 2,500 years old. They found heavy residue of cannabinol, the molecular signature of cannabis. But this wasn't wild, low-potency hemp. The chemical signature showed that the cannabis being burned had unusually high levels of THC, suggesting that these people were either selecting specific potent strains or cultivating them for their psychoactive effects. The braziers were found in a funerary context, used to fill the air with smoke during burial rites. It seems that for ancient humans across the Silk Road, the transition from life to death required a chemical escort. But why is it that we see this same pattern? Cannabis in China, opium in Mesopotamia, nightshades in Spain, appearing in almost every major civilization at the same developmental stage. Is it possible that the plants weren't just a byproduct of culture, but the primary architects of it? And if these plants were so central to our development, why did they remain hidden from the archaeological record for so long? The answer to why this evidence is so elusive lies in the fragile nature of the plants themselves. Most psychoactive substances are organic. They rot, they burn, and they leave almost no trace in the soil. It is only through the advent of molecular archaeology that we are finally seeing the true scale of ancient drug use. In South America, at the site of Chavín de Huántar in the Peruvian Andes, the evidence is literally carved into the stone. Dating back to 1200 BC, the temple complex features massive stone heads with contorted faces, many of them showing mucus streaming from their noses, a classic physiological reaction to snorting the hallucinogenic snuff made from the vilca tree or the San Pedro cactus. In 2019, a ritual bundle was found in the Lipez highlands of Bolivia that contained a leather bag made from 3 fox snouts. Inside, scientists found traces of 5 different psychoactive compounds, including cocaine and DMT. The bundle was over 1,000 years old. The fascinating part is that several of the plants required to make that cocktail didn't grow in the highlands. They had to be brought from the Amazon rainforest hundreds of miles away. This was a sophisticated, cross-continental delivery system for spiritual experiences. If these ancient people were willing to trek across the Andes and through the jungle just to obtain a specific hallucinogenic vine, what did they believe was waiting for them on the other side of that experience? And how does that relate to the most controversial theory in the history of human evolution, the idea that we didn't just use drugs, but that they literally made us who we are? This brings us to the stoned ape hypothesis, a concept that was once dismissed as a psychedelic fantasy but is now being revisited by some in the scientific community with a more nuanced lens. proposed by Terence McKenna in 1992, the theory suggests that as our ancestors moved out of the receding forests of Africa and onto the grasslands, they began following herds of cattle and, by extension, consuming the psilocybin mushrooms that grew in their dung. McKenna argued that low doses of psilocybin improved visual acuity for hunting, medium doses increased sexual arousal, leading to more offspring, and high doses dissolved the ego and catalyzed the emergence of language and religion. While the original theory was criticized for its lack of genetic evidence, modern neuroscience has discovered something that McKenna couldn't have known at the time: neuroplasticity. We now know that psilocybin and other psychedelics are psychoplastogens. In a landmark 2018 study from the University of California, Davis, researchers showed that these compounds literally cause neurons in the prefrontal cortex to grow new branches and form new connections. They don't just change how the brain feels, they change the physical architecture of the brain. If our ancestors were repeatedly exposed to these growth-promoting compounds over thousands of years, could it have played a role in the rapid, unprecedented doubling of the human brain size? And if our biology was being sculpted by these plants, did we develop a symbiotic relationship with them that we've only recently forgotten? But even if we set aside the more radical theories of brain evolution, we have to deal with the undeniable chemical reality of our own heads. Why is it that the human brain possesses specific, highly specialized receptors for molecules found in plants like cannabis or poppies? We have an endocannabinoid system and an endogenous opioid system. We produce our own internal versions of these drugs. This suggests a deep, evolutionary history where our brains were shaped in an environment where these external plant molecules were a constant presence. It wasn't an accident, it was a lock-and-key mechanism that took millions of years to refine. In ancient Egypt, the blue water lily, Nymphea caerulea*, is depicted in almost every tomb and temple. It contains apomorphine, a compound that acts on dopamine receptors. For centuries, Egyptologists thought the flower was just a decorative symbol of the Nile. Now, they realize it was likely soaked in wine to create a ritual intoxicant used to induce states of prophetic dreaming. If the ancient Egyptians were using chemistry to hack their dopamine systems, and the Greeks were using ergot-infused grain at Eleusis to induce mass religious visions, then the history of the Western world is not a history of sober rationalism. It's a history of managed altered states. But why did this widespread, sacred use of drugs eventually turn into something hidden, stigmatized, and feared? This transition from the sacred to the suppressed is perhaps the most mysterious part of the story. For the vast majority of our history, there was no such thing as recreational drug use. It was always purposeful, always ritualized, and always collective. The shaman in the Menorca cave wasn't getting high in the back of the cave for fun. They were performing a service for their tribe, using those nightshade alkaloids to navigate the terrors of death and the mysteries of the seasons. When the Greeks drank the Kykeon at the Eleusinian Mysteries, it was a once-in-a-lifetime initiation that even the greatest philosophers, like Plato and Marcus Aurelius, claimed removed the fear of death. These substances were the glue that held societies together and gave them their shared meaning. But as civilizations grew larger and more centralized, the unpredictability of the individual visionary experience became a threat to organized power. The decentralized, plant-based spirituality of the shaman was replaced by the centralized, text-based authority of the state and the church. We moved from a world where everyone had a direct, chemical line to the divine, to a world where that line was cut and replaced by a middleman. If we lost that direct connection, what did we lose in our understanding of ourselves? And is it possible that our modern struggle with addiction is actually a misplaced, starving version of that ancient, holy drive? We are currently living through what many call the psychedelic renaissance, where modern medicine is finally circling back to the very substances we found in those 3,000-year-old hair tubes. At institutions like Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London, researchers are finding that psilocybin can reset the brain of someone with chronic depression in a single session. They are finding that MDMA can heal the deep scars of PTSD by allowing the brain to process trauma without fear. This isn't new discovery, it's a rediscovery. We are spending billions of dollars in state-of-the-art labs to prove what a Bronze Age shaman in Spain already knew, that the human mind is not a static thing. It is a fluid, chemical landscape that sometimes needs a specific botanical key to unlock its true potential for healing and understanding. But if we are finally coming back to this ancient knowledge, will we treat it with the same reverence our ancestors did? Or will we try to turn the sacred into just another commodity? As we look at the timeline of our species, the period of time where drugs have been illegal or taboo is a microscopic sliver of the whole. For 99% of our history, we were the people of the mushroom, the people of the poppy, the people of the vine and the grain. We didn't just start taking drugs recently, we started taking them the moment we became human, and they likely helped us make that leap. Every time you feel that sense of wonder at the stars, or that deep, unexplainable connection to another person, you might be feeling the echoes of a brain architecture that was built in the company of psychoactive plants. The evidence is no longer just in the history books, it's in our very DNA. And if we want to understand where we are going, we have to be brave enough to look at where we've been, even if that means looking into the bottom of an ancient, stained cup. Does the fact that our greatest intellectual and spiritual achievements might have been fueled by drugs make them any less real? Or does it make the human story even more incredible, that we were a species so hungry for meaning that we were willing to reach into the dirt and eat the very things that would change our minds forever? The tube of hair from Menorca wasn't just a relic, it was a witness. It sat in the darkness for 3,000 years, holding on to the chemical secrets of a person who saw things we can only dream of. That red dye on the antler container wasn't just a color, it was a warning and a signpost. It tells us that for the ancient humans, the journey into the mind was the most important journey of all. They didn't just stumble into the dark, they went there with intention, with chemistry, and with a profound respect for the power of the plants they shared their world with. And perhaps the most haunting piece of proof isn't the chemicals themselves, but the way that hair was found. It wasn't scattered or lost. It was carefully cut, placed in a protective tube, and hidden where it would be safe from the passage of time. It was as if they knew that one day, we would lose our way, and we would need a reminder of what we once were. They left us a message in the form of a single, preserved strand, that the door to the other world has always been there, and we have always held the key. The question is, now that we've found the key again, are we ready to walk through that door, or are we too afraid of what we might find on the other side? The deep history of human intoxication reveals a species that has never been satisfied with the world as it appears to the naked eye. From the very first Natufian brewer in a cold cave to the modern neuroscientist in a sterile lab, the through line is identical. We are a species defined by our reach for the stars, our reach for the past, and our reach for the hidden corners of our own consciousness. We have always been travelers, and the most important landscapes we've ever explored weren't across oceans or mountains, but within the 3 pounds of biological machinery sitting inside our skulls. The drugs weren't the destination, they were the vehicles. And as we look back at those ancient sites, from the high peaks of the Andes to the deep caves of the Mediterranean, we see the same story repeated over and over. We are the architects of our own experience. We are the weavers of the chemical dream. And that Bronze Age shaman, with their hair dyed red and their mind expanded by the nightshade, is not a stranger from a primitive past. They are the mirror of who we have always been, a creature that will go to the ends of the earth to see what lies just beyond the veil. The story of drugs is the story of us. It is the story of how we survived, how we thrived, and how we found the courage to ask the biggest questions a mind can ask. We have been taking these substances since the dawn of time because they offered us something that survival alone could not: a sense of the infinite. And while the names of the plants change and the chemicals become more refined, the pursuit remains the same. We are still that same ape, looking at a mushroom in the grass or a flower on the riverbank, wondering what will happen if we take a bite. We are still looking for the divine in the dirt. And as long as we have brains that can dream and plants that can change them, that search will never truly end. It is our oldest tradition, our most sacred drive, and our most enduring mystery. And in the end, perhaps that's the real reason we hidden that hair so carefully, not to hide our shame, but to preserve our power. Think back to that small red-dyed tube in the Menorca cave. It wasn't hidden by accident, it was a deliberate act of preservation. The hair inside belonged to someone who had spent their life navigating the boundaries of reality, someone who had seen the structure of the world through a veil of atropine and scopolamine. When their community placed that tube in the back of the cave, they weren't just burying a person, they were sealing a testament to the fact that humans have never been alone in our own heads. We have always had companions, the plants, the fungi, and the molecules that wait in the dark to show us who we really are. And that is the most definitive, haunting proof of all, that even 3,000 years ago, we knew that the most important thing a human can do is change their mind. If you found this exploration of our ancient, chemical origins as fascinating as I did, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think our ancestors were following a biological drive, or were they uncovering a spiritual truth that we've forgotten? Or perhaps you've come across a piece of history that shifts the timeline even further back. Share your perspective in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to see how this changes your view of our history. And if you want to keep diving into these kinds of rabbit holes with me, consider subscribing. There are plenty more mysteries waiting to be unsealed. For now, just remember that the next time you look at a simple plant or a common flower, you might be looking at the very thing that made you who you are today. The past is never truly gone. It's just waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered, one molecule at a time. This has been a journey through the deep time of the human mind, and the most incredible part is that we are only just beginning to wake up. Stay curious, keep questioning, and never be afraid to look a little closer at the things most people walk past. The history of the world is hidden in the smallest details, and sometimes, those details are dyed red and hidden in a tube of hair, waiting 3,000 years for someone to finally ask the right question. And now that we have, the world will never look quite the same again. The ancient ones are still speaking to us, if only we are willing to listen to the chemistry. That is the final heavy truth. We are the people who dream with our eyes open, and we have been since the very beginning. The rest is just a matter of timing. The hair from the cave wasn't just ancient protein. It was a chemical map of a year in the life of a visionary. And as we close this chapter, remember that the red dye used to color that tube was the same cinnabar used in the world's oldest religious sites, a color that represented life, blood, and the transition between worlds. They didn't just give us their hair, they gave us their proof. We were never just animals looking for food. We were always something much stranger and much more beautiful. We were the species that decided to look at the dark and find the light, even if we had to grow it from the ground. And that, more than any tool or city, is what truly makes us human.